Forced and arranged marriages have been a fundamental part of Indian culture since time could tell. A forced marriage is when the person has been pressured into marrying someone without their consent. An arranged marriage is when they've willingly given consent to marrying the person chosen for them. Many years ago, the bride and groom were neither asked for consent, nor were they informed about their partner. But with the evolution of time and changing society, the man and woman are usually asked for consent. The procedure begins with matching the horoscopes of the couple, the background of their families, and the castes in order to find out if the two are compatible. The wedding commences with strict rules and rituals. After the marriage, the bride is bid farewell as she joins her husband's family. As I have grown up in the UK my entire life, I find it extremely hard to understand how parents can pick out a partner for their child to marry and expect the relationship to run smoothly. After living under the roof of my two parents who had a forced marriage, I would like to understand what kind of impact it has had on my mother's life as she travelled across the world to marry a man she did not want to. My mother, Nina Kantharia, was born in the UK. She has now been married to my father for 25 years.
It was always talked about in the house that I would go to India to find a husband and bring him back over into this country. I was told about the caste system from quite an early age, that I would have to marry somebody that was in the same caste as me. And because there wasn't enough choice in this country, the caste system is very similar to our British, the high class, lower class and middle class. And there would be more of a choice if I went to India. I would have a much varied choice. I was taken to India by my mum. I was introduced to between 10, 15 boys. They were from different backgrounds. Some were really, really well educated. There were solicitors, doctors, accountants, and we were also introduced to sort of less educated men who were basically just trying their luck because they knew it was better for them to come to the UK because of the better living standards. Instantly wasn't attracted to the men I was introduced to, one of them being my husband. Wasn't attracted to him to start with. I actually chose him. It was sort of best out of the bad bunch, really, and as a last resort I actually agreed to marry him. My friends were starting to settle down. They were going out, enjoying themselves, had boyfriends, which because it had been drummed into my head that it was wrong to have a boyfriend, I actually was made to believe that what they were doing was wrong.
As I was doing some research on forced marriages, I came across an online forum. Many women were sharing their stories over the internet with others who had been through the same process. One woman's story really shocked me. I was eager to find out more. She agreed to meet me and discuss her story further. She has decided to remain anonymous.
I had an arranged marriage at the age of 23. I always knew I was going to have an arranged marriage, but I didn't really know what was involved. I had no choice but to have an arranged marriage. I didn't know much about my husband when I first met him, and I didn't know a lot more when I married him. He seemed okay at first, but as I got to know him, I found out that things weren't as they seemed.
My wedding day, everybody around me was really, really excited. I was really scared, really nervous. Wasn't convinced that I'd done the right thing. Didn't know what to expect, didn't know his family. Knew I'd be staying with him for a few weeks. But it was too late, I had to go along with it. Stayed with him for 3 weeks. Didn't really get to know him that well. When I returned back to the UK, I remember just constantly watching our wedding video, trying to convince myself I'd done the right thing. Did think at one point then, and I did actually confess to my mum I wasn't happy. We both agreed it was too late.
When I came back to England, my husband wrote me letters, and in some of them it said that he needed money to pay off a friend who he'd borrowed from. So eventually I realised family were in debt. After a while I found out that the people who'd introduced us had said to my husband that if you marry this girl, you can go to England and you can help your parents with their financial problems. Began to have doubts about what his main objective was for marrying me.
The other hurdles I faced was trying to get him over into the country. We'd been married nearly 5 years when he was eventually allowed over. I was given advice by a solicitor to make out that it was a love marriage, not a genuine, not a arranged marriage, as the High Commission wouldn't believe us. So I made up this really, really pathetic story, which me and my husband decided that we were going to stick to. We basically met on the beach, fell in love, got married. Obviously, the British High Commission didn't believe us. And again, I even thought at that point that I could just divorce him. It was going to be so much easier than fighting the immigration, trying to get him into the country. I was actually also told that if I had a child in this country, they would allow him into the country easier. So I went out there, got pregnant, came back, had a baby, brought her up on my own. While I was there for 6 months in India, I was basically treated as a servant. I was doing all the housework in his parents' house. There was 6 of them in his family. I was doing all the housework, washing their clothes by hand, things I just wasn't used to, but things that I knew I'd be expected to do as a daughter-in-law. I nearly had a miscarriage because I was doing so much work in the house.
We had our first child in 1991. We started having a few small arguments. He started swearing. He would get angry quite often. One day he was angry for some reason and he had the baby in his hands. She was about 16 or 18 months. And he was angry, and while he was shouting, he threw her across the double bed and she nearly hit her head on the wall. So I got really scared and worried for her. So I phoned the social services and we also had her checked out at the doctor. She was fine, but I began to get worried that what if this happens again? The anger and violence still carries on. Doesn't look as though things are looking any better.
He eventually came over 5 years later and things were really, really difficult for him. Obviously, it was a culture shock. He didn't know what to expect. I remember my daughter being really dubious of him. She was 1.5 and she was just wondering who this strange man was that had come into our lives, which was really, really difficult for me. We started to try and get my husband a job. Because he hardly spoke any English, I was filling out all his forms, even attended some of his interviews to be the interpreter, all the things that I wouldn't have had to do if I'd married somebody from this country. I've always been really stressed. It's like bringing up another child, doing all the things that I would have expected him to do for me, I was doing for him. Expected his food on the table when he came through the door. If he didn't like the food, he would expect me to cook again. Soon we had a second child. And basically I was the mother and father of the children. He was somebody who just went out to work, socialising with friends, drinking, coming home drunk. And if we had an argument, there'd be shouting in the house, there'd be verbal abuse in front of the children. The verbal abuse then started to become physical. He'd throw things at me. He would shout. The verbal abuse then started to become physical. He'd throw things at me. He's tried to strangle me. Because my husband was violent to me in front of the children, my son actually started to become violent towards me. If he didn't get his way, then he started biting me, and I actually ended up taking him to a child psychologist who actually asked about our relationship. It was only at that time I realised that it was because of what my son had seen and the relationship, that's why he was doing what he was doing.
In 94, we had another baby. My son seemed ill, so he had to be tested for malaria because we'd recently been to India. At the same time, my husband visited the doctor for cold and flu-like symptoms. There, he was told that he was hepatitis C positive. Alarm bells started to ring when I asked how this was passed. I realised it was the same way that HIV is transmitted. I asked for an HIV test. We both came back positive. The doctor said that he'd had HIV for a longer time than I had, that if he hadn't come to the doctors at that time, he would be dead within 18 months. I kept asking him, and he eventually admitted he'd been sleeping with prostitutes before he married me, and probably while I was in England as well. The medication costs £500 a month each, and obviously this is paid by the NHS in Britain. If he was still in India, I don't think he'd be alive now.
On my wedding day, what should have been the happiest day of a girl's life, I was actually really, really scared deep down inside. I was trying to hide the fact that I was scared. Everybody around me was really, really happy for me. I was really nervous. I knew I hadn't made the right choice. I wasn't attracted to him. Really, really wasn't happy. When I thought that my parents were arranging my marriage, they were doing the best that they thought for me. I thought it was the best thing they could do for me. I thought I'd be really, really happy. I didn't imagine what I've had to go through. The only positive thing that's come out of my marriage, I would say, is my 2 children actually speak Gujarati fluently. They've been able to communicate with my mum, who doesn't speak English. Basically, there really isn't anything else positive. I wouldn't recommend having an arranged marriage. I know my mum still feels that she did what was best for me, and even after we've had all our problems, she still feels she did what she thought was best for me, and she says it was just bad luck. I've always blamed my mum, because my life could have been so much different. I would have been so much happier. I do blame my mum, and I would never put my children through what I've had to go through.
Forced marriage has been recognised as such an inhumane practice that it is now a criminal offence since June 2014, to help people in England, Wales and UK nationals overseas who are at risk of becoming a victim of a forced marriage. Should the importance of leading a happy life override the illegal cultural practice of an old-fashioned tradition?